Right, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Sanctuary Graduates' Social Mobility Week and our first session, which is an introduction to social mobility. My name is Tom Freeman. I'm the founder and MD of Sanctuary Graduates, and we've had over 1,300 registrations for the week from early careers professionals, D&I, higher education professionals who all want to learn more about social mobility within the early career space, which is great. Really heartwarming to see that what matters to us so much at Sanctuary Graduates matters to so many of you too. You're all very welcome. Okay, just a quick introduction to the week. Firstly, I'm going to share a little information on what we have in store for you today and for the rest of the week's Lunch and Learn series. Then I'll briefly introduce Sanctuary Graduates, our passion for and our thought leadership in social mobility and diversity generally within early careers. And then finally, I'll hand over to Will, who recently joined Sanctuary from our official partners, the Social Mobility Foundation. Will, in conversation with Maureen from the Foundation, will explore the issue of social mobility, the problem, the terminology, and Maureen will go through some of the key findings from their employer index. This will kick off our series. In the second half of this session, I'll pose as many of your questions to the panel as possible. So please do send in your questions on the Q&A function within Zoom throughout the session. Our COO, Elle, is moderating, and we'll try and get as many of your questions answered by the panel as possible. Okay, agenda for the week, as you can see on your screen, today's the introduction session with the Foundation. Tomorrow at the same time, 12 o'clock, we have the employers session, which is a panel discussion chaired by Sanctuary Graduates with guest speakers from some of our clients from different industries. So Goldman Sachs, JLL, Schroders, and Jess Booker, who's an early careers professional, a seasoned professional across a number of industries. They'll be talking about what their organizations have done to attract, hire, retain, and promote graduates from working class backgrounds. Wednesday is the university session. And this session will be about how universities support students from less privileged backgrounds. And we've got three very different universities joining us: Warwick, West London, and Liverpool, looking at sort of their different strategies and schemes that they use to support their students from less privileged backgrounds as they join, as they go through university, and as they transition into the world of work afterwards. And finally, on Thursday at the same time, 12 o'clock, is our student session. I know from some employer feedback that is our most popular session, as a lot of you want to hear what some of our hand-picked students and recent graduates who are from less privileged backgrounds have to say. One guy in particular, Aman Abdul Rahman, some of you might remember from the BBC documentary way back in the halcyon days before COVID and lockdowns and all of that. He was the main protagonist in the Breaking Into the Elite documentary on the BBC, which we supported with Amol Rajan, and he now has a graduate role. So it's a happy ending to his story, but he'll be telling us and some of his counterparts at different universities about their journey through school, university, and then into the world at work. So that's the week. I hope you'll find it really useful and interesting, and there'll be lots of chance to ask lots of questions throughout. Before I hand over to Will and Maureen, just a very quick introduction into Sanctuary Graduates. We are a 10-year-old business, and we have built campus networks and university partnerships at 120 universities, which allow us to reach any student studying for any subject from any demographic at all UK universities by email, social media, and other means. In addition to that, we have diversity data from our partner universities and from HESA to help our employers choose where to go, which universities, which departments with their message in order to attract and hire the right graduates and interns for them. Here's a flavor of our campus networks and university partnerships that we've built, which allow us to reach any student at all UK universities. A real mix of our academic department partnerships who send on emails to their students on our behalf. We have formal relationships with the University Career Services working in partnership to reach students by email and social media, a large database of talent, student society sponsorships, and we have access to widening participation cohorts at a number of our partner universities. Diversity, this is why we're here, and diversity and social mobility run right through the core of Sanctuary Graduates. It's something which I am personally deeply very passionate about, and for many people, social mobility is something that is inherently good because it plays to our idea of the importance of fairness. And it matters to me particularly, especially as I've grown older and begun to really understand the relative advantage that I was lucky to enjoy throughout school, university and beyond, and the expertise that I and my colleagues could share with others. And back in 2017, I was looking for a way for myself and for the business that I run to give back, almost share that advantage and have a positive impact on the social mobility of the many less privileged students that we serve as a business. I happened to read about the foundation in a magazine which was looking for support for their student cohorts that they look after. So what started with supporting their students before they go to university with a crash course on graduate recruitment and life at university, and then with CV mock interviews, mentoring and workshops for current university students, has blossomed into a full partnership with the foundation, where we now donate a part of the revenue we get for every diversity attraction campaign we run to the foundation. And we also encourage and help them encourage employers to take part in their employer index, which we'll touch upon later. And our work for the SMF has also led us to support many of our career service partners by providing pro bono expert sessions for their widening participation cohorts. We sponsor hundreds of student societies, and that journey from partnering with the SMF in 2017 has culminated in Sanctuary becoming thought leaders within the space, and we now run dozens of social mobility and diversity attraction campaigns for many of our clients. As for Sanctuary Graduates, more than half of my colleagues have at least one social mobility flag, and our COO, Elle, who is running tomorrow's employer session, first started with us as a graduate 7 years ago, and is also the first generation of her family to go to university. And her rapid success and rise through our business is a source of constant satisfaction for me. Very briefly, our products, what we do, for those that manage their own recruitment, we run attraction and diversity campaigns using those unique campus networks I mentioned earlier, and we run dedicated digital brand ambassador campaigns, normally along diversity lines for many companies. We have the full suite of candidate management, screening and assessment center services from our expert in-house team. And finally, we deliver end-to-end recruitment for lots of companies, from 1 to 100 plus grads and interns annually. Finally, just a flavor of some of the companies we work with. Many of you are here today, or many of you work for some of these businesses, big, small, across all industries, and here's just a flavor of some of the companies we work with. Right, enough about Sanctuary. I'm going to hand over to Will now to let him introduce himself, talk through the issues and some of the key terminology with Maureen from the foundation. Will.
Thank you very much, Tom. So great to meet everyone. A little bit more about myself. So obviously, as Tom mentioned, I've recently joined Sanctuary Graduates from the Social Mobility Foundation towards the end of last year, where I worked in Maureen's team. So similarly to Tom, social mobility is something that's been important to me for a long time, both personally and professionally. And a big reason for me joining Sanctuary is that social mobility is something that is core to the values of the company. And it's great to have the opportunity to speak at events like this to a really wide range of employers and universities and individuals like yourselves. So let me hand over to my former colleague, Maureen from the SMF, to introduce herself and talk a little bit more about the issue of social mobility in the UK and a little bit more about the SMF too.
Great, thanks a lot, Will. I'm very excited to be here and to be joining Sanctuary Graduates Social Mobility Week. Just a bit about myself and the SMF. Like Will said, I'm Maureen. I'm the Senior Employer Relations Officer and Index Lead at the SMF. So I work in our Employer Relations and Business Development team. And the SMF, or Social Mobility Foundation, is a charity that supports high achieving students from low income backgrounds. And we do try to tackle and promote social mobility across the UK through 3 different kind of branches and approaches. So first of all, we do run our student program, which is a 5-year program, which is a mixture of career guidance and university application support to encourage students to attend university and then also support them into competitive professions. Secondly, we run the Social Mobility Employer Index, which I'm going to cover in a bit, which helps us to kind of define and promote employer best practice for social mobility across the UK. And then we recently launched our Department for Opportunities, which is our policy and advocacy arm, which kind of tries to tackle social mobility on a wider scale through running campaigns UK-wide. And our latest campaign for this is a campaign to end laptop poverty for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So why social mobility? It is often still the case that your background determines your success in life, and there are a number of barriers to social mobility across the UK. So if you look at the stats here, only about 6% of doctors across the UK are from a working class background, only 12% of chief execs are from a working class background, and a low ability child from a high income family is 35% more likely to become a high earner than a high ability child from a low income family. And there are a number of reasons behind these figures. So first of all, a person from a lower socioeconomic background often does not have access to as strong of an education, and they might not have access to adults who work in professional sectors who can give them advice and guidance and support on how to enter those sectors. They might be the first in their family to consider university, and therefore might not have the same level of guidance that others are offered who might have parents who attended university or other family members. And of course, the current pandemic and the homeschooling is going to make this gap even bigger, because students from a lower income backgrounds often don't have a quiet space to study. They might not have access to their own laptop, and they might also, or they are not able to afford private tutoring like a lot of students from more advantaged backgrounds are going to be able to afford. And the next slide shows an infographic which kind of demonstrates a proportion of each of these professional roles that are taken up by privately educated individuals. And just in a comparison, the general population that attended private education in the UK is approximately 7%. But here we can see that 65% of senior judges attended private schools. And even in jobs where you wouldn't expect necessarily, like newspaper columnists, 44% attended private education. And the representation is also critical here, as those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are unable to see people like themselves in those roles, and therefore they are less likely to aspire them or to feel welcome within that kind of working environment. And the next slide does show that as well as there is a distinction between private and state education, there are also geographical factors in social mobility. The Social Mobility Commission published a report called the State of the Nations Report in 2017, which I would recommend everyone to read if you want to learn a bit more about social mobility in the UK. And this report outlined how well different local authorities in England are performing against certain social mobility indicators. What was found is that there are certain cold spots across the country where the opportunity for social mobility was significantly lower. And on the screen, you can see the best and the worst 20 local authorities for social mobility. And the findings did conclude that there is actually no simple north-south divide like many believe, but there is a major divide in England today that exists between London and its commuter belt and the rest of the country. So the economic strength of the capital means that it offers opportunities that other parts of the country struggle to compete with. And that is why the SMF does work in London, but also works across 6 other offices in the UK. And we also try to target social mobility cold spots outside of our target cities. And that is something we encourage employers who do outreach activities to do as well, to look which areas of the country might have less support from employers like yours, and where could you support the students there. I'm going to cover the index in a bit more detail in a few minutes. I'm going to hand over to Will now to define social mobility a bit further.
Thank you very much, Maureen. So as a lot of you can imagine, social mobility is very much on a lot of people's agenda at the moment, which is fantastic. However, as with any issue of this nature, there's a fair bit of jargon and terminology that's used when talking about it. So for those that are just starting to look at the issue of social mobility, I wanted to talk through some of the terms that are often used and are likely going to be used in this session and later this week as well. So starting with a simple definition of what it is. Basically, absolute social mobility is where people end up in their careers in comparison to their parents. So this can be in terms of both income, what a person earns compared to their parents, but also can be reflected in the movement of people into what are considered more prestigious or influential occupations. So in practice, social mobility is often used to refer how easily students and young people from low income backgrounds are able to break into top professions such as law, finance, medicine, or politics. So this is where organizations like the SMF, which obviously Maureen is from and I used to work at, that's what they work to do, is breaking down some of those barriers for those students. So as Maureen mentioned, in the UK, your own occupation is heavily linked to the profession that your parents did. If your parents worked in law, finance, or any sort of professional or related sector, you're significantly more likely to work in something that is as equally well respected and as equally well paid. So in part, if your mum and dad are a doctor, lawyer, or banker, you're far more likely to understand how to become one and have access to high quality work experience, professional advice, and strong networks and contacts. So reaching top jobs is also something that is heavily linked to someone's educational background. Those that attend private schools are far more likely to enter these top professions. I'll go on to this in a little bit more depth in a moment, but universities are also a key factor in social mobility. So many prestigious educational institutions within groups such as Oxbridge, the Russell Group universities, they tend to have a much larger proportion of students from independent and grammar schools than from state comprehensives. This has a knock-on effect as many big employers across sectors will look to hire from these top universities. So the issue of social mobility in a broader sense, as reflected by some of the stats that Maureen gave us, is that the most prestigious universities, the top professions, they do not reflect the social makeup of the UK and are disproportionately represented by those that have attended fee-paying schools, selective schools, and those that come from high-income backgrounds. This, to me, is showing that employers and universities have massively undervalued the potential of students that are from less privileged backgrounds and have predominantly focused on those who've already got a bit of a step up in life. Basically, those from affluent backgrounds have an easier time in accessing the best of what the UK has to offer in terms of universities and employment. So now going over some of the key terminology, perhaps if we start with some of the different schools in the UK. So non-selective state schools or comprehensive schools, these are schools that most of the population attend. You don't have to sit an exam to get in, and of course, you don't have to pay to go. So this, as Maureen mentioned, makes up 88% of UK students. They attend non-selective state schools. And though this represents most people and the majority, often when we are talking about students from low-income backgrounds, these are the sorts of schools that are likely to attend. I want to make a distinction too with comprehensives to grammar schools. So grammar schools are where students don't pay fees, but sit entrance exams to get into those schools. They make up around 5% of UK students. There's a lot of debate in terms of the relationship between grammar schools and social mobility, which I won't go into now, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about this. And I'm sure Maureen has some statistics to also back that up in the Q&A function later on in the session. So finally, you have private or fee-paying schools, which make up 7% of the UK student population. So despite the vast majority of UK students attending non-selective state schools, it is quite shocking the extent to which top universities and top professions are overrepresented by those that have attended private and grammar schools. So now that we've discussed, some of a little bit of background on the basics of schools in the UK, we'll go over some of the most used terms when talking about social mobility. So first in the family to attend university. This means basically that the student's parents and grandparents did not attend university in the UK. They're first in first generation in the family to attend university. However, it's worth noting that siblings and aunts and uncles don't count towards this in most definitions. It's mainly about your parents and your grandparents, whether they went to uni. So another key term is free school meals. So this is where a secondary school student comes from a household with an income of less than £7,400 a year, and they're therefore eligible to receive free school meals. This is a key metric when talking about social mobility, as it's an empirical measurement of social background and is quite a good kind of tracking way of looking at this group of students that are definitely from low income. Oxbridge and Russell Group universities. So something that's often talked about in relation to social mobility are the Russell Group universities. Basically what these are, if you don't already know, are the group of 24 leading UK universities. These include Oxford and Cambridge. It's often used as shorthand for top universities within the UK. As I've mentioned already, many employers will target these universities for their graduate intake. You know, broadly speaking, because they produce excellent graduates, and there's no kind of getting away from that. But what is worth reiterating is that because of a high proportion of this student intake of these institutions come from fee-paying or selective schools, they are effectively, to a lesser extent, favouring more privileged or affluent students. Basically, because low students have a harder time accessing the best schools, they therefore have a harder time accessing the best universities. And a knock-on effect of that is then you struggle to getting into those top, those top careers and those top professions with those best employers. So widening participation is a big factor in improving social mobility at universities. We'll have a session on Wednesday where we're going to hear from widening participation teams at several different unis. What these teams do in looking to address the imbalance in intake is increasing those that are underrepresented in higher education. So this might be those that are eligible for free school meals, those that are first in the family to attend university, but it might also include those who have attended low-performing schools. Maybe they're from areas in the country that don't see large numbers of young people attending university, or they might be from ethnic minorities who are underrepresented in UK higher education. So I'm hoping this has cleared up some of the terms and phrases that's going to be used both in the rest of today's session and in other sessions this week. If there's anything that I've talked about that you want to know a little bit more about, please do use the Q&A function in Zoom, and let me hand back over to Maureen to give a little bit more information on the Social Mobility Index. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Will. So the Social Mobility Employer Index was established in 2017 to encourage firms to become more accessible to individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And the index ranks UK employers on the effort they are making to improve social mobility and to attract and progress talent from all backgrounds within the organization. However, it's an audit, not necessarily an award. And over the last 5 years, it's the 5th year of the index running this year, which is very exciting. We're hoping to make a big year for the index in terms of employer submissions and also in terms of the analysis we're going to be providing. And over those last 4 years, over 200 participants have submitted to the index, which makes the index the authority on employer-led best practice across the UK. And the index helps your organization to answer the question, do people enter and progress within your organization based on their ability and effort, or does social mobility or their class affect how successful those individuals are within your organization? And if social background plays a role, the index tells you what you can do about it and also monitors your progress. And on the screen, you can currently see the top 75 from our 2020 index. And overall, we did have 119 employers from 17 different sectors participating in the index last year. The index open now for submissions until the 28th of May, but later on in the Q&A, I'm going to provide a bit more guidance on the technicalities of submitting to the employer index. I'm now just going to quickly talk about why it is helpful for organizations to enter the index, and then also give you some practical examples of initiatives or best practice that we have seen in the index from previous employer submissions, to give you an idea of what kind of tips and advice you can expect from submitting to the index. So on the next slide, you can see a few reasons why it is helpful for organizations to submit to the Social Mobility Employer Index. First of all, it is a free of charge audit and you can enter anonymously. So each organization receives an individual feedback report highlighting areas they performed well in, where improvements can be made. And you're also going to be able to see how your organization performed in each section compared to all other index entrants. It's also possible for you to meet with the index team after you have received the feedback report to discuss your individual feedback in a bit more detail. And the feedback we receive from previous participants is that many organizations have found it very useful in forming their social mobility strategy or monitoring the progress of their existing work. And previous participants also said that it was a great tool to get senior buy-in for diversity initiatives, such as changes in recruitment process or where to focus when attracting talent. Like I mentioned, you can enter anonymously if you wish. We only ever publish the top 75, and we do not disclose any rankings for any organization outside of the top 75, but even if you are in the top 75, you can enter anonymously. Secondly, social mobility and the SEB of the workforce is becoming more and more important to clients as well. Last year, about 86% of entrants said that their clients care about the socioeconomic background of their workforce, and the same applies for graduates and other applicants as well. So the social agenda of an organization is becoming more and more important for graduates and also experienced hires when they choose their future employers. By participating, you can be a trailblazer for diversity and social mobility. If you enter the index, others will follow entering the index, and this will raise awareness for social mobility more broadly across the UK. And of course, the index is helping you to assess if your recruitment approach is getting the best available talent. And I'm going to focus or mention that in a bit later on when I speak about best practice as well. On the next slide, there's just an overview of what we are looking at across the index. So there are roughly 100 questions in the index, and these questions are grouped in 7 different sections or key areas which drive social mobility in employer best practice. And these 7 areas do cover the entire employee cycle or employee journey. So we do start with the outreach. We look into how can young people access your organization. Do you offer apprenticeships and internships? Then we look at how do you attract your talent? Do you go to universities and visit universities to recruit graduates? If you do so, which universities do you visit? Do you run any programs to attract students from a lower income background? And we look with you at your recruitment process, really anything from your website to see if the website provides sufficient advice for people from a lower SEB onto your your actual recruitment process to see what do you look at in your recruitment process, and might there be barriers for students from a lower socioeconomic background that they might be falling down. And we also look at progression of experienced hires, your internal culture, and how you speak about social mobility with your employees. And there is also an employee survey which is optional to participate in, which just gives you a good idea how your employees and your staff actually perceive the culture in your workforce, and if they feel that they can progress within your organization independently of their social background. The index is submitted online, and there is a lot of help available along the way. So we can have one-to-ones with you before your submissions. We have guidelines. There are going to be webinars, and the team is also available for any other ad hoc questions you might have. On the next few slides, I'm just going to give you examples of what advice you can expect when participating in the index, and this advice is drawn from the best practice that we've seen from index participants in previous years. I won't speak about all of them. I just select the few that I thought might be particularly interesting for this group. Let's start with recruitment and selection. So one big theme in this section is that your recruitment process should judge the potential rather than the past academic performance and polish of the people who apply to your organization. So you should be looking at rewarding current skills and future potential over past academic performance. And for this, you can start collecting data or look at the recruitment process to see if your recruitment process accurately assesses the potential of a candidate in terms of the role that they're applying for. And we would also recommend to monitor if there are any stages in the recruitment process where students from a lower socioeconomic background disproportionately fall down in the recruitment process. And a few examples of practical solutions or examples of barriers for students from a lower income backgrounds, and how you can kind of remove those to level the playing field are to remove and reduce A-level or degree requirements in your application process, to flag students based on their socioeconomic background data, and also to start having a second look and in the recruitment process to students who might not have made it to the first few stages, but who do have like a few flags for social mobility, and to see if it's worth having a second look at them and maybe fast track them to interview or assessment center. But there are many more tips and advice in the key findings document from the index that you can find on our website, which I'm going to show you in a bit as well. Next, on the next slide, I just want to quickly look at data collection with you, because data collection is often the first step and is essential to form a social mobility strategy. To look at your data, to collect your data, look at the data and see where might there be issues within your organization. Maybe there isn't an issue at all. And if there are issues, how can you tackle those issues, just to be able to make a well-informed strategy for social mobility and set your social mobility targets accordingly. So we do recommend to collect at least 3 data points for your current workforce and also new hires, which are any of parental occupation, type of school attended, whether the parents attend university, and whether they were eligible for free school meals. If you only collect 1 data point, we recommend to collect the data point on parental occupation. And the Social Mobility Commission, in cooperation with the SMF, has published really good guidance on how to analyze this parental occupation. And we also came up with benchmarks that you can benchmark your organization against should you start to collect this data. Once you started collecting this data, we recommend to publish the data and also to present this data to your board or management team to encourage senior buy-in for social mobility initiatives, because in our experience, and that's something we often get from participants of the index as well, once you have the senior buy-in for initiatives for social mobility, it's much easier to kind of roll them out company-wide and get a lot of support for those. And then looking at kind of the progression and experienced hires on the next slide. Oh, sorry, this is just one slide to show you how many of the previous participants are collecting the data. So you can see that the number of organizations collecting data on the school, on free school meals and first generation to go to university for new hires has increased throughout the years, which is great to see. And over half of the participants also kind of present their social mobility data to their board, which is a very encouraging trend to see as well. So a lot of organizations seem to be taking data collection in terms of social mobility background quite serious. On the next slide, we then look at kind of progression of experienced hires. And again, here, data collection plays a vital role. We do recommend organizations collect data on the retention, progression, and pay in the organization using socioeconomic metrics, because there is still a pay gap across the UK for people from a working class background. So you can see the current pay gap is £2,243 per year. We would also ask you, if you work with external recruitment agencies, to ask for a diverse range of candidates, to ask for a diverse shortlist candidates from a diverse background, and then to look into creating strategies for improving retention and or progression for people from lower income background. And on the next slide, you can just see some examples of what other index participants are doing. So quite a few of them are offering buddying for people from a lower SEB. Employee networks have been starting to play a more and more important role across organizations. The same with mentoring leadership programs. We would also encourage you to kind of create a formal sponsorship program that duplicate the informal sponsoring that often happens for organizations in terms of promotions, pay rise, etc. Just to formalize this approach to make it accessible for everyone and not just for people who went to a certain university, a certain school, or might have done certain internships, part-time activities in the past. On the next slide, I've just put you some key dates for the index. The index is open for submissions now. It closed on 28th of May. And then in autumn, you can expect your feedback report. And we're also going to be publishing our key findings report, where a lot of things that I discussed today are summarized for you again. If you're interested in registering for the index, please go to our website, which you can see there. And there's a link where you can register for the index. And then you're also going to have access to the index questions and our guidelines. If you have any other questions, you can also just send me an email on employerindex@socialmobility.org.uk. And we're also going to be running a webinar just about the index with Sanctuary Graduates on the 11th of May between 12 and 1 p.m. And Sanctuary Graduates can share the sign-up details with you after this call as well. It'd be great to see many of you participating this year and also to help spreading the word to suppliers and clients. And I'm happy to take any question you might have about the SMF, social mobility, and the index in our Q&A.
Great, thank you, Maureen and Will. That was very much a very gentle introduction to the subject. We go into a lot more detail with universities and employers and students at the rest of the week. So there's a lot of questions that people have had so far. So thanks for sending those in, and please do keep sending those in now. We've left plenty of time now for the rest of the hour to put the most salient of those questions to the panel. First of all, a lot of people are asking for slides on the terminology. We will send those later in the week just to give you some very easy to digest information about what all the terminology is and what it all means in our sector. We'll send that to all of you. Maureen, a question for you. There are a number of people attending today that are quite at the beginning of their journey, let's say, in terms of diversity and social mobility, and want to learn and probably want to know what the starting point is. So for any organizations or individuals that are just starting to look to improve their understanding of the area and to improve the social mobility of the employers that they work for, where would you recommend that they start?
I think a very good starting point is by attending webinars like this and just doing some reading around social mobility. So the Social Mobility Commission has a lot of good publications on social mobility. There are also a lot of good newspaper articles. Sam Friedman, who's a researcher on social mobility, has published a good book called The Glass Ceiling on social mobility. So I think that is the first good step to kind of know about social mobility, and then also being able to speak to your managers or senior members of your business. And then if you want to start with social mobility, a first good step is to include data on the SCB of your workforce in your the surveys you send to your staff. So I know that a lot of organizations collect data on ethnicity, religion, gender, etc. So I think it's a good first step to include one or best 3 questions on the social background of someone. And this is going to show you where you can start or where you should start with your strategy, because for some organizations, attraction might be an issue. For others, it might be an issue to progress people from a lower social background through your organization. And I think quite simply, because you are attending a webinar on Sanctuary Graduates, I think it is important to diversify your attraction for the organization. So that could be done by working with widening participation teams across universities rather than targeting just the full university. To look at the universities that you visit, like Will already mentioned, focus on diverse universities and not just the Russell Group universities, for example, which are the least diverse universities across the UK. And then also look at the recruitment process to see, are there certain barriers which might be difficult for students from a lower income background. This can be from your website, where certain acronyms and terms might not be explained for those students, to that students from a lower income background might be performing less well in your assessment centers because of the type of tasks that you ask them to complete.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Keep your questions coming in. We've got plenty to deal with at the moment. Will, we've got a university session tomorrow, but a question has come in about whether Russell Group universities ought to Well, are they doing enough to support working class students, both perhaps from the intake and then through the transition into the world of work? What's the, I guess, the view from the foundation and from the outside before we put those sort of questions to the universities tomorrow?
It's on Wednesday. The university session is on Wednesday. I think to sort of quite directly answer that question, I think they have started to do more. You know, universities like the University of Bristol, which sits within the Russell Group, were early adopters and using contextualized offers. And that's something that has been a real change in the last few years, is actually universities looking at, you know, the school you attended, the area that you went to school, whether it was low performing, and then actually whether they really need to really need to look at that and actually be a little bit kind of softer on some people, potentially harder on others, actually where they went to school and what, you know, where they came from. I think that's very, very relevant at the moment with the last sort of summer of exams, where that was only on kind of predicted grades, and that, you know, was massively taken into account. So I still think there is a fair way to go for the Russell Groups, but they've definitely taken steps, and I'm sure, you know, some of the widening participation teams from University of Liverpool and University of Warwick on Wednesday will be able to tell you a little bit more about that. I'm sure Maureen's also got some input on kind of the university side of it too.
I think I would have also just added, a lot of universities are now running programs for students from a lower SEB. So a lot of summer schools are focused on the students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but they're ring fence based for those students. And we work with a lot of universities at the SMF and visit loads of those universities with our students, and we usually always deal with the widening participation team, so it is on the radar for a lot of universities.
And just to add to that, I would say that in addition to that question about getting into university, there is another point where actually supporting students while they're actually at university, and actually how are they getting on while they're there. That's a sort of separate question entirely, and actually the university is going to be best placed to answer that. Obviously, organisations like the SMF support students while they're at university, but the kind of the role that universities play, you know, in supporting them actually in getting into top jobs is another factor. But I think Wednesday session is going to be good to really kind of dig into that.
Thanks both. There's a question that's come in relation to COVID-19 and the pandemic, and I suspect this is because I've noticed that the message is really cutting through the national media in the last year or so, and the widening gap between rich and poor from students at primary and secondary and age and beyond. Maureen, from your point of view, looking at the data that you've got and the work that you do, how has COVID-19 affected students and young people? How bad is it actually the last year or so for students and young people from low income backgrounds?
Yeah, I think it has put students from a lower income background at a big disadvantage, having to kind of learn from home, might not being able to have the resource at home that students from a more advantaged background might have at home. So we did a tech survey with our students just to see if they had a laptop available, a quiet space to work with, etc., which might pose an issue for students who might be sharing a bedroom with their siblings, for example, might be sharing a laptop with their siblings, if they even own a laptop. That's why we've also started our End Laptop Poverty campaign with the Department for Opportunities to kind of collect laptops for those students who may give them the same technical equipment that students from more advanced backgrounds might have. And that's also something I would recommend if any of you are hosting internships or maybe even hosting kind of outreach internships for students with lower income background, to check in with them. Do they have a laptop? Do they have a quiet space to work? And make everyone who's dealing with them in the organization aware that there might be someone walking into a session suddenly just because the student might not have the privacy that someone might have with their own bedroom. And then I think, of course, the entire A-level results last year have put students from a lower income background at a disadvantage, because those students might not be able to take legal action against their school for better grades. So I think those are all factors which put students from a lower income background kind of a vulnerable position, not just in terms of their progression, but also I think just in terms of their feeling of how well they feel supported from society, from the school system in the UK in the current pandemic.
What I'll just add to that as well is you know, Marine's obviously sort of mentioned work experience. That is a massive factor, is that a lot of students from low income backgrounds that would have got support from, you know, organizations like the SMF with, you know, going in person to doing work experience placements. Obviously, there has been some virtual work experience that organizations like the SMF have been able to do. That's a real factor, that students from low income backgrounds are really missing out on that, you know, that 2 weeks where they've you know, they managed to get a work experience placement, you know, through organization support, through kind of a formal work experience program, or equally kind of off their own back. It's just far harder for them to have that, you know, now where you aren't able to do that in person, whereas students from more affluent backgrounds can just have that, you know, that phone call or that week's work shadowing with mum, dad, aunt, uncle that works in finance. You know, the students that are from low income backgrounds just aren't able to do that. So that is a real, you know, problem for them as well this year. It's just the lack of work experience.
Understood. Thanks both. We've got a lot of questions in relation to recruitment practices and what employers do. And there's a couple here that actually I would like to put to the panel today. I think something that best left for tomorrow's employer session. Particularly, I think this question actually from Marine about sort of how to monitor. A lot of firms say, look, okay, I want to do something. They think about what they can do from an attraction perspective. But often the question that they find hardest to answer is, how do you actually monitor or evaluate within a business social mobility or widening participation programs? Well, first of all, monitor is there a problem to solve, and what is it? And B, how do you monitor the success of any program you put in place? Any sort of entry level advice for people with that question on their minds?
Yeah, so I think the first bit of advice is data. So it's quite important to collect the data to kind of have a basis that you can work from. And like I said, this data collection often happens just alongside the normal annual kind of employee survey that employees fill in. If someone enters the organization new, is often included kind of in their starting questionnaire for their organizations. And a lot of organizations also run a social mobility day or social mobility week or diversity week, where they then kind of try to get up completion rates for those questions. And we often kind of get the feedback that are already a lot of questionnaire that employees have to fill in. There is a bit of like a questionnaire fatigue across organizations. That's why I would recommend to just try to kind of get those questions included into your normal questionnaire. So it's not like an extra questionnaire, but it is just like 3 clicks in your existing questionnaires. So I think that is a good starting point. And then in terms of looking at the success of initiatives, so if you look at your outreach activity, for example, a great way to measure success is to track the students who participate in the outreach, track their education outcomes, their career outcomes, and then I think the ultimate success would be if some of those students then are successful in obtaining graduate roles or apprenticeships, school leaver programs within your organization. And really helpful for that is if you just like keep in touch with the students and then track them through your application process again, and maybe even fast track them if they participate in some of your outreach activities before. But I think generally it is a lot related to data, just because the data can give us kind of a bulletproof view if there is an issue and what the issue might be, because the issue might look different in a lot of different for each organization.
Thank you. There is one question actually in relation to recruitment practices I'd like to ask you, mostly because obviously we'll cover this heavily in the employer session, but just as an entry level answer for those professionals thinking, okay, well, generally speaking, what are the right lines to go down? What kind of recruitment practices lend themselves to diverse recruiting?
So where we've seen success from participants in the index, or I would say like the top performing employers in the index, they usually have reduced or completely removed their A-level and degree requirements for their courses. A lot of them do not look at the school attended and grades in the first sipping or like the first few stages of the application process, and then usually flagging candidates depending on some socioeconomic measures is quite successful as well. So you can ask candidates certain questions on the first generation, their parental occupation, which school they attended, if they weren't with school meals, and then flag students who tick some of those boxes in the application process, have a second look of the students if they fall down at certain stages of the process, and then after all, also look at the entire process and see where did you lose those students with the flags, and how can you maybe make the recruitment process more accessible for them. So if you see a lot of them fell down when writing essays, for example, maybe try to change this essay task into a different task, or just provide more guidance on what you are expecting to those students, because they might not have anyone in their family who is able to proofread what they've read for them, or just give them advice on what an employer actually wants to hear in those questions.
Thank you. Actually, building on that answer, actually, Susan has asked a question to the panel, which when we worked with the SMF with you guys the first time, you helped us build a framework so we could understand of all the students we work with in our database, what the flags were, what questions we needed to ask to get the answer we needed to understand who we were dealing with, who needed support, and so on. What specific questions should employers be asking at the application stage or wherever? What are the sort of the entry level questions one would ask to give you a flavour of the people that are applying?
Yeah. So if you only ask one question, we would we and also the Social Commission recommend to ask the question on the parental occupation. So what was the occupation of the main earner in your household when you were aged 14? And the Social Commission has provided a great toolkit helping employers how to analyze those questions, how to group the different professions, and then group them into people from a lower social background and people from more advantaged backgrounds. That's the question that we recommend to ask if you only ask one question, which already is a good starting point. Overall, the recommendation is to ask at least 3 questions just to have a good kind of overall insight into kind of the data of your workforce, just because if you ask just one question, sometimes the student might have still attended a grammar school, for example, or an independent school because they received a bursary or a scholarship. So we do recommend that you ask at least 3 questions, and those 3 questions can be the parental occupation. Then if someone was first in their generation of family to go to university, if someone attended a selective or non-selective state school or an independent school, and then also if there have been on free school meals at any time since year 7. I think if they went to school after 1980 or 85, so that's when kind of free school meals came into play.
Thank you. Well, there's a question for you, a great question, actually. I've been talking to a lot of heads of careers recently, and a lot of them say, we've got all this great support for our WP schemes or widening participation, but it's very hard to get students to come forward to actually use it. The supply outweighs the demand in some universities. Generally speaking, the question says, generally students from disadvantaged backgrounds are the least likely to reach out to use the support that's available to them. Will, you work with the students at the SMF for many years. What advice would you give in how to reach these cohorts in order to provide support?
Yeah, that's obviously, they've got to be using the support that's available to them. But I think it is really about being persistent. It's just, making sure that you've got this great support. Actually, are you going to make sure that it is super, super easy for the students to actually get that support and actually to use it? So making sure that you are, even with it, during my time at the SMF, there was so many different ways we were supporting students. And actually, a big part of it was actually just making sure that we knew the students well enough so that we were making sure that they were actually using that support. So, having a bit of more of a sort of a two-way relationship, I think, is a really good way of doing that. Making sure it's really apparent, it's really, really easy to use, and also that you are making sure that it's, across. It might be that you do it via a few different methods of promoting it. It might be that you use course reps or use departments or something along those lines to really make sure that it's very, very apparent and they're very aware of the support that's out there. Yeah, absolutely, that's and that also I think would be relevant for our university session on what advice that they've got for that too.
Gotcha, thank you. Just going back to the index briefly, just use the last couple of minutes to talk about how any employers or anyone watching and listening today can interface with the Foundation Marine. Obviously, doing the employer index is a big investment in terms of time, a worthwhile one, of course, but could you perhaps give us a couple of sort of key reasons why employers should take part in the employer index and make that time to look at the data and fill out the forms? What are the What are the reasons for doing so?
So I think one of the main reasons is that is free of charge to enter. So by entering, you don't have to spend any money from the diversity budget into entering the index, for example. And it is a free of charge audit. So every employer who enters the index receives a very detailed feedback report detailing how you performed in each of the sections of the index. Your benchmarks against other organizations submitted in the index as well. For each of those sections, you can see that maybe you're doing really well in terms of attraction compared to other organizations, but you're not doing as well in terms of progression of experienced hires in other sections. And then in your feedback report, we tell you where you're doing well, which improvements can be made, and how those improvements can be looked like. And also, even if you, or especially if you are at the beginning of your social mobility journey, it's a great way for you to kind of look at your organization and then just see where is the biggest issue. And then we are going to be able to give you very good, practical and tangible next and first steps to go and to take in order to tackle social mobility within your organization. And a lot of organizations found it really useful in forming their strategy. If you are a bit further progressed in a social mobility journey, it is a great way for you to monitor your progress, especially if you start submitting to the index every year. And just for everyone who might not have started with data collection yet, please still participate in the index, because we do ask about data. We also ask a lot of questions that every organization will be able to answer about your recruitment process, about your outreach programs, about your internships, if you offer apprenticeships, etc. And I know that 100 questions sounds quite threatening, but we do not expect every organization to answer all those questions. So if you are only interested in feedback in a certain section, just fill in that section on, I don't know, recruitment, for example. You're going to receive feedback on that section then. And if there are certain sections where you feel we actually don't have the information yet and it's going to take too much time out of our kind of resources, please, just submit the section that you have information for, and you're going to receive feedback on those sections, which might be close to your heart at the moment.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, I would encourage any employer to get involved. It's a free audit of where you're at, and anonymous if needs be. So I would certainly encourage. We have a section, Maureen and Will, don't we, on the index in much more detail. Can you have a bit of information, if everyone's diaries now, more information about the timelines for that event?
Yeah, and I also share the link to sign up to the index with Will. After the sessions, you can share it with everyone who attended the webinar. If you are planning to attend, to maybe submit in the index or interested, I'd recommend to have a look at the questions now. Maybe we have a first start, and then you can bring all the questions you have about the index to the sessions on the 11th of May. But I would recommend to make a start now, just to give you, which is still about 1.5 months until the index closes, and to give you plenty of time to see who in your organization might need to provide you certain information to participate in the index.
And as Maureen mentioned,
timings, how long would it take an employer, how much time to set aside to do, I mean, not all of it, perhaps a section at a time? How long do you recommend to set aside to do that?
I think it really depends on how much of the information or data is available, how many different individuals are kind of engaged with the index. So from what I've heard from other organizations, most organizations kind of divide the different sections between teams, between colleagues, because some are going to be looking at internships, some are going to be looking at HR data, for example. So don't feel that you need to fill it in yourself. Share the questions with your team, which the index platform enables you to do as well. And then it really depends on how many sections you fill in and how much of the information is available. I would start now, like I said, if you would like to participate in the index, because it is a bigger piece of work. But from feedback from organizations, I've heard that it is requires less resources than some other indexes that a lot of organizations participate in regularly, and also requires less data and less proof of the data.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Okay, we are out of time. Thank you very much to Will and Maureen for joining us today and sharing those insights, and for all of you for coming. Tomorrow is our employer session, Wednesday our university session, Thursday our student session. Chance to ask lots more questions, learn a lot more. Thanks for coming today, this afternoon, and we'll see lots of you again tomorrow.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
thank you very much.